Good morning, and welcome to the 2023 SPR Annual Meeting. Before we begin, I want to thank the Conference Planning Committee, the Abstract Reviewers, the SPR Board of Directors, the NIH Institutes that helped fund our R13 conference grant, and anyone who I might be missing that played a key role in helping to organize our conference. As always, we prepared a conference program for you that will highlight impactful research, practice, and policies for public health and prevention science. We also hope that this year's conference will serve as a platform to exchange ideas and gain knowledge and learn new skills that can help us aid our respective work as we fight towards social justice and health equity. So let's move on to today's first plenary session on structural inequality, marginalized communities, and health equity. And I would like to thank my co-chair for this conference, Dr. Nadine Finnegan-Carr. Today we have three excellent speakers who are truly leaders in their respective fields. Our first presenter will be Dr. Adriana Umaña-Taylor, Professor of Education at the Harvard Graduate School, at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Dr. Michael Lindsey, who is Dean and Professor at the NYU Silver School of Social Work, and Darlene Flynn, who is the Executive Director of the City of Oakland Race and Equity Department. So with that, I'll turn it over to our first presenter, Dr. Umaña-Taylor. Thank you.
All right, good morning. Great to be here with you today. Excited to share with you a little bit about my work focused on intervening in adolescents' ethnic and racial identity development in the school setting. I'd like to begin, however, taking a moment to acknowledge that I'm sharing my work with you today on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Nacotchtank and Piscataway people who originally inhabited and settled this land. I also wish to acknowledge the legacy of enslavement of both Indigenous people and of the enslaved Africans whose labor was exploited for generations to establish the economic growth and development of our nation and build many institutions of higher education that some of us call home. These are legacies and features of the socio-historical context that are always important for us to acknowledge because we must continue to make the invisible visible. But they're also particularly relevant to the work that I do, focused on young people's development as it relates to their identities that are marginalized on the basis of race, ethnicity, cultural heritage. And it's the continued negative impact of these legacies together with the resistance against this marginalization that really make a focus on understanding young people's ethnic and racial identity development particularly important. So let me tell you a little bit about this work. In my career, I have focused almost exclusively on studying the development of ethnic racial minoritized youth in the context of the USA. And what we know about the US context is that all people in the US experience a racialization of their identities based on phenotype, ethnicity, migration status, documentation status, religion, and the intersection of these and many other social identities. This means that as adolescents are increasingly thinking about who they are, who they were, who they can become, their ethnic racial identity becomes a big part of their developmental process. In fact, we know from self-categorization theory that in societies where inequities based on a particular social identity are pervasive, that social identity domain will be salient. And our young people are certainly exposed to these inequities on a regular basis and through various mediums in their daily lives. We also know from theory that when young people are racially othered, these experiences inform their identity as it pertains to their sense of worth and belonging in that society. This racialization informs whether they're viewed as an in-group member, an out-group member, how they're treated, and most importantly, their access to power and resources. All of this informs the way that they see themselves and ultimately their identity. And what I argue is that this racialization has significant implications for young people from ethnic racially minoritized groups, but ultimately it also has very significant implications for our society at large. And this is because what we know from decades of research now is that ethnic racial minoritized status is a developmental risk factor. Why? because it places young people at risk for experiences with ethno-racial discrimination. And with discrimination comes significant risk for maladjustment. And we see this playing out with respect to health and many indicators of general well-being. We also see this specific to academic outcomes and mental health, with evidence of disparities at all levels of our education pipeline, from primary school all the way up through higher education. And we must shine a bright spotlight on these academic disparities because education is a key social determinant of health. And these social determinants of health have a tremendous impact on life chances in our nation, and they contribute to the large health disparities that exist in our nation. Another important fact for us to consider is that a key predictor of a nation's economic development and success is the nation's investment in the human capital of that society. And I think that many of us in this room would agree that all of the evidence available to us suggests that we are failing to invest in the full human capital of our society. In fact, as this pie chart shows, a majority of our K-12 student body is comprised of students of color. And in a few short years, this K-12 student body will be the group that we're looking to for leadership, for innovation, for creativity. Yet we have compelling evidence showing that we're not serving or supporting a large segment of this large and growing group of our nation's young people. Excuse me. So ultimately, we need to accept that the future success and well-being of our society will depend on how well we address issues of ethno-racial inequities in our education system now and in our immediate future. And this is where a prevention science framework comes in, because while a part of the story may be about developmental risk and experiences of marginalization, another very important part of the story, perhaps the most important part of the story, is about resilience and the strength of our young people. In fact, a developmental prevention science approach tells us that we can effectively prevent maladjustment and promote adjustment by building on, strengthening, and supporting the developmental competencies that serve as protective and promotive factors and are associated with our young people's resilience. And there is significant existing theory and research suggesting that ethnic racial identity development may be one such competency that we can leverage. Specifically, we know that identity formation is a key developmental task that is gaining momentum during the developmental period of adolescence, and that developing a greater sense of clarity regarding the personal meaning of one's identity that is achieved via a process of meaningful exploration is associated with a greater sense of global identity cohesion and synthesis, all of which can have really positive psychosocial benefits for our young people. We also know from a growing body of work that when educators take a culturally sustaining approach to their work with students, in which they're recognizing, celebrating, and incorporating their students' ethnic and racial identities into the classroom, this can disrupt patterns of marginalization and promote academic and psychological adjustment for our students of color in particular. So this brings me to the Identity Project. The Identity Project was designed to be a school-based health promotion program, and it was designed to target the developmental processes of ethnic racial identity exploration and resolution. The curriculum provides students with strategies, tools, and time with which to discuss issues of race, ethnicity, and identity in the classroom setting, explore their own ethnic racial identities, learn about their peers, learn about their teachers' ethnic racial identities, and reflect on the meaning of this aspect of identity for their own sense of self. The manualized curriculum enables educators to have planned activities that follow a learning arc, where students are initially introduced to or given the opportunity to share their existing knowledge and about basic concepts related to race and ethnicity. They explore their identities in relation to these concepts. They have opportunities to think about themselves and others in context. And ultimately, and perhaps most importantly, through this program, students are developing a sense of agency that they are in charge of deciding who they are and how they think about themselves with respect to race and ethnicity. The curriculum consists of 8 lessons. They last about an hour each, and they're designed to be delivered once per week. And the theory of intervention for this curriculum is grounded in the developmental notions I introduced earlier. So essentially, these various activities are hypothesized to lead to increases in students' personal ethnic racial identity exploration and support the development of a greater sense of clarity and understanding of their ethnic racial identities. Together, these increases in exploration and resolution of ethnic racial identity promote a greater sense of global identity cohesion, which is theorized to have positive downstream impacts on young people's psychosocial adjustment. Conceptually, these psychosocial benefits are coming about because youth are gaining a more mature understanding of their ethnic racial minoritized status. They're developing a sense of self-assuredness and clarity regarding their ethnic racial background that can protect their psychosocial adjustment when they experienced ethno-racial based threats, and they're developing tools with which to better understand and cope with these negative experiences, all of which is promoting greater global identity synthesis and cohesion and less identity confusion. To initially test the efficacy of the Identity Project, we conducted a randomized control trial with 215 students in the Southwest US. We randomized at the classroom level, and the sessions for our intervention and an attention control curriculum were taught by the same facilitators. Students had the same contact time in both programs with facilitators, and the control curriculum was designed to use the same exact pedagogical approach for each session that was being used in the Identity Project curriculum. Really helping us to control as much as possible that the only difference between these two curricula was essentially the content that was being taught, because they were being taught by the same individuals. What we found was that at 12 weeks, there were significant increases in students' ethnic racial identity exploration for youth in the intervention condition. We also found at 18 weeks that those increases in exploration predicted significant increases in ethnic racial identity resolution, but only for youth in the intervention group. And ultimately, findings from our one-year follow-up indicated that those increases in ethnic racial identity development at 12 weeks and at 18 weeks were significantly associated with better grades, higher self-esteem, lower depressive symptoms, and increased global identity cohesion a whole year later. The next big question for us then was, how can we strengthen these effects and scale up? And so this naturally led us to consider the incredible power of educators and the positive impact that they can have on students. Of course, we know that significant harm is experienced in the US education system by our students of color, but we also have evidence, as I introduced previously, that educators who take a culturally sustaining approach can effectively promote the academic success and psychological adjustment of students of color. So our key questions then became, can we train educators? And if we train educators, will we see similar intervention effects? So in an effort to begin to answer these questions, my team and I developed the Equipping Educators for Equity through Ethnic Racial Identity Professional Development Program. We call it E4 for short, for obvious reasons. And this program focuses exclusively on training educators to implement the Identity Project and to engage in conversations with students about race, ethnicity, and identity. Our approach for program development involved assembling an interdisciplinary team. We also leveraged community-based participatory research practices to ensure that our target audience would be well served by this program. We did this by initially conducting interviews with our teachers, really asking them about the challenges they perceived, the assets they perceived to be bringing to this work, as well as what their training needs were. We also shared with them activities that we were developing, and we got their feedback on the plans that we had, which had been based on reviewing the literature, right? Then we engaged them in what we called a participatory and collaborative revision process, whereby they first participated in our training program as participants, and we were watching and observing how were they engaging with the curriculum, what were some things that were not landing well, what were some things that were going particularly well. After the training ended, we then conducted focus groups and individual interviews with each teacher who had participated to get more feedback from them now that they had gone through the entire training. Ultimately, and actually, prior to that, sorry, I'm missing a few bullets here. And then at the end, a few of the teachers from our training actually went on to implement the curriculum with their students. So we went back to them after that implementation and we interviewed them again. So now you've been trained. Now you've actually done the curriculum with your students. Now, what can you tell us about our training program? Where did we, get it right? Where did we miss the mark? What can we take out of this very long program? And what's missing, right? And so ultimately, our program is grounded in theory, prior generative research, insights gained from teachers through these various data collection methods. And so our training is a 32-hour training. It's not short. It really uses minimal didactic instruction. We use pair, small group, and large group activities, and there's continuous reflection and sharing with colleagues throughout. The other really important part of this program is that teachers engage in the identity project sessions themselves as participants, the ones that they will be doing with their students, to really give them a sense of what it is that they're going to be working on with their students. The training includes four learning domains. I'm not going to go into them now here because I don't have a whole lot of time, but I'll say they focus on gaining ethnic racial identity content knowledge, reflecting on their own ethnic racial identity development, understanding race-based systemic inequities, and also learning and practicing facilitation strategies for talking with students about race and facilitating those conversations in a classroom setting. So one of our recent projects, that My Life, My Identity project, has enabled us to examine the feasibility of training teachers to begin to explore the potential for an effectiveness trial. This project has also enabled us to gain deep insights into students' perspectives as they're going through the curriculum. The MLMI project is a longitudinal study of ninth graders whose U.S. history teachers were trained to do the identity project. They were trained and they implemented the program in the fall of 2021. We conducted pre-test, post-test surveys, just as we did in the original efficacy testing. But the additional thing we did with this project is we conducted 16 daily diary check-ins with the students as they were engaging in the curriculum. So every week there was an identity project session. We pinged students twice. One of those times was when they had had a lesson. Our sample includes 180 adolescents, and you could see here the distribution by gender, by nativity status, by family migration status, and the ethnic racial composition of our sample, which mirrored the ethnic racial composition of the school in which we were conducting this work. So what did we find? We tested a latent difference score model to examine intra-individual change from pre-test to post-test, and we indeed found that exploration significantly increased from time 1 to time 2. Our results also indicated that there was significant variability in this change across participants, confirming what we had learned in our initial efficacy trial, which is that some students changed more than others, and those who started out with lower levels of exploration demonstrated a steeper growth over time, just as we found in the original efficacy testing. Finally, there was no variability in this change as a function of key sociodemographic factors. And essentially, in a more audience-friendly illustration of our findings, here's what change looked like over time with a paired samples t-test. And ultimately, how did this compare? You can see here, when teachers implemented the curriculum, our effect size was a Cohen's d of 0.52. When researchers implemented the curriculum in the initial efficacy testing, the effect size was a 0.17. So I believe that what this shows us is really the tremendous power of educators and the potential for this type of intervention if we can engage teachers and leverage the powerful student-teacher relationship. So another exciting part of the MLMI project, though, is that for the first time, we actually had real-time data from students letting us know what was it about this curriculum that they were engaging with. And so one of the questions that we asked at every daily diary check-in was, what did you enjoy the most about the most recent identity project lesson you had in your U.S. history class? As we explored students' responses over the course of 10 weeks, 5 different themes stood out for us. First, students shared that they appreciated the opportunity to explore and share their identity with others, particularly without the fear of being judged. Sorry. Let me just share one quote here. And these are verbatim from students' own responses. So one student shared, "I like that there is no wrong answers in how you see your own ethnic racial heritage." A second theme was that students really appreciated connecting with their peers and building community. One student shared, "I'd like learning the different parts of myself that I never really thought about. I also liked learning about everyone and their identities. I saw that my classmates and I are all different and similar in many ways." Students also particularly appreciated having the opportunity to talk about race, ethnicity, stereotypes, and discrimination. I think that one of my favorite quotes is actually this last one because it's just so simple. "I like how we talk about race." Students appreciated the opportunity to connect with family. This was a school-based curriculum, but it gave opportunities for students to have conversations with family, as this first quote illustrates. The family map thing was interesting because we got to make something, and also we held conversations with our families, or at least I did with my parents, that I otherwise wouldn't have had. And then finally, it was so refreshing to see when students are being asked, what do they like about a curriculum, that they spontaneously mention their teachers. And in particular, students really appreciated that their teachers were creating a safe space. They really appreciated that they were able to share this part of themselves with their teachers. So students' perceptions are important. I have focused my entire career on studying adolescents. So I am the biggest cheerleader for understanding what adolescents are thinking. But we also know that teachers play a critical role in whether or not a program is going to be successful. And perhaps their opinions actually matter the most about whether or not any curriculum is going to fail or going to flourish. So we interviewed teachers after they had completed the implementation with their students, and we asked for their perceptions. What value did they find in this curriculum? What were the unique opportunities that they thought the curriculum provided? And from their responses to those questions, we drew three general themes. First, teachers felt that the focus on ninth graders was right on target. As one teacher shared, "I think that it's really important because it disrupts stereotypes that kids walk around and have about each other, right? And it disrupts some of the, you're a teenager, you're trying to figure out how you fit into this world. And now all of a sudden you're recognizing all these other outside factors that are weighing into who you are as a person. And I like the idea of at that exact moment where those differences are really becoming more palpable. Not that they aren't before, but I like the idea of disrupting that. And I think that's a really important part of our job." A second theme that emerged was that teachers felt the curriculum provided an excellent and important opportunity to build and strengthen student connections. I'll read the bottom quote here. A teacher shared, "I think there was some team building that happened. I think it opened us up to each other." And then finally, teachers felt that the curriculum provided a concrete way for students to be able to see themselves in the curriculum, and felt that this was essential for students' academic success and engagement, which we know from the literature is essential for their success and engagement. So I'll read the bottom quote here. "Because in general, kids are always like, oh, history happens. It's in the past, blah, blah. It's boring, whatever." But again, taking that and just thinking okay, when we get to the identity project lesson, they're going to have some historical events and connect to that to themselves. So the opportunities for a curriculum such as these different findings from these multiple studies show are really tremendous, right? There is a tremendous opportunity here in terms of the potential of a program such as this, particularly with respect to positive youth development, bridging home and school, improved school climate, strengthening student-teacher relations, and informing a global developmental science. I haven't been able to share much about that, and I won't be able to share much about that here. But what I will say right now is that the Identity Project has been adapted and is being tested in 6 different countries throughout Europe. We're also in the process of exploring adaptations in 2 countries in South America, countries that have their own very unique socio-historical context of exclusion and inclusion based on the racialization of particular social identities, right? And so my colleagues and I recently published a paper in the European Journal of Developmental Psychology describing our process for cross-cultural adaptation of the Identity Project, which was conceptualized and initially tested in a country with a particular socio-historical context of race, right? The US. But nevertheless, we are finding that it has significant relevance in these other cultural contexts because ultimately this is about racialization of social identities and power. So there is a lot of exciting potential for this work, but in order to realize these opportunities, we need to move forward on several future directions. First, we need large-scale efficacy trials of both the Identity Project and E4 together. We must have samples that enable us to explore variability as a function of these key socio-demographic factors, and we must move toward examining options for scale-up, such as flexibility and modes of training. All of these exciting future directions require large-scale studies, partnering with many schools, and training many educators, which brings me to the very last part of my message, which is the challenges of this work. One of the biggest challenges that we're facing as we do this work is the current socio-political climate. We are in a highly contentious socio-political moment in our nation's history. There is a significant political and ideological divide with respect to discussing issues of race, ethnicity, and identity in the classroom. We see this from some administrators, some teachers, some parents, and some students, even in our local communities in Massachusetts, where I'm currently doing this work. And even if the local context is generally supportive of the work, at the national level, there is significant hostility and structural resistance to this work. In a majority of the states in our nation, we have seen legislative action to restrict educators' abilities to teach about racism and related concepts, essentially criminalizing these conversations in the school setting. And so this highly contentious political climate leads to significant hesitation, understandably so, on the part of teachers and administrators about being involved in these research practice partnerships focused on this topic, which this work absolutely requires. As you saw from the findings, we must engage educators in this work for maximum impact. There are also significant psychological and physical health costs to the people who are doing this work. I call this the collateral damage of the work because it often goes unnoticed and untended to. And finally, there is the very logistical barrier of time. We're working with professionals who are already overburdened with too many demands on their time and insufficient compensation. These challenges have serious implications. They directly impact our science. We are conducting our work with a restricted range of the population. Equally important, these challenges bring significant threats to our society at large. The ideological divides create toxic and hostile work environments for our educators, and that impacts our students. This also further promotes a color-evasive approach to education, which is harmful for students' learning and impedes creating a bias-free school climate. Not because I've said so, but because we have seen this empirically. The evidence is there to show us this is not good for any of our students. Together, these factors perpetuate and reproduce longstanding ethnic, racially based inequities in our school system, and all of our students' learning and development is harmed because no one is learning how to think critically or how to engage in dialogue about these pressing social issues that will only become more pressing as our population continues to change. Simply put, the inability to explicitly discuss race, ethnicity, and identity in schools and to investigate the effects of doing so will not only maintain and exacerbate ethno-racial disparities, but it is also going to leave us ill-prepared for the future. I have a tremendous amount of people to acknowledge because this work was, I'm standing here delivering this information, sharing this information, but this really has been a very, very large effort on the part of many folks who are listed here, including the foundations that have supported it. And thank you for your time. And I look forward to the other presentations in our conversation.
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here and to have this opportunity to share some of the work that we've been doing. Just a few caveats. I'm going to talk about some studies and not in great detail, but if you're interested in the details, including the methods, analyses, I will be sending articles out about that if you contact me. I'm going to weave together some stories and collectively tell a story of impact that we've been endeavoring to have in terms of the rising rate of suicide and suicide behaviors among Black youth. I just want to also caveat that what I might present this morning could be triggering. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that. I don't know how to advance the slides. All right, so I always like to begin the talk that I do related to this topic, centering this moment and really reflecting on the lives of precious souls that are dying by suicide. So Ryland Ty Hagan, like me, is from Washington, D.C. In 2017, 11 years old, his mom came home to find him deceased. Seven Bridges, 10 years old, Louisville, Kentucky, also found by his mom, 10 years old. And I've actually interviewed both mothers extensively for a book project that I'm working on. And what's really, really devastating in both instances is that both moms indicated that they had no idea their sons knew anything about suicide. No idea, no signs, nothing. What we know is that Ryland and Seven are part of a growing trend, first documented by Jeff Bridge and colleagues at Nationwide Children's Hospital at Ohio State University. And as you can see, the top trajectories for Black youth, their data started in terms of their analyses, looked at 1993 all the way through 2012, and found that the trajectory over that time of suicide were rising among 5 to 11-year-olds, and particularly among Black youth, that trend was rising. Then Jeff and colleagues updated their analyses looking at 2001 through 2015 and found that it was almost 2 times higher for Black youth, not discovering in this study that there was a sex identity difference. It was actually for Black children in general. So we have published a study in the American Journal of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry that was actually featured in the New York Times. I won't bury the lead, but one of the major findings was that we found from the years 2003 through 2017 that the rate of suicides among Black females were rising. And so we wanted to look at precipitating circumstances, back to this notion or idea that parents, loved ones don't have any sense or idea what's happening, right? So we looked at 2 data sources from the CDC, the WISCARS and the MVDRS, to determine what were associated with suicides. And this was only among Black youth. And as you can see here, that bottom trajectory is that for Black females and the top one for Black males. And we looked at the ages 5 through 17. And so the bottom trajectory, again, Black females, and there was a 6.6 annual percentage change increase over that span of time, while it was only 2.8% for Black boys. So rising faster among Black females. In terms of precipitating circumstances, for the 5 to 11-year-olds, and for among them, those who had a diagnosis on record, ADHD was identified among 73% of the youth who had a diagnosis in that age category. And then for the 15 to 17-year-olds, we found that there was a relational conflict 24 hours preceding, documented to be 24 hours preceding their suicide, which is really interesting in the context of helping young folks be able to reconcile relationship challenges. And I'll talk about that more in a few minutes. But also among that group, dysthymia or depression was identified for the 15 to 17-year-olds. We also discovered that for the 15 to 17-year-olds, the method was a firearm. For the 5 to 11-year-olds, the method is mostly suffocation, hanging, or strangulation. So you can see that as you get older, the lethality of the method actually increases. And I'll also talk about that momentarily. So in another study that, a couple of studies I'm going to talk about really quick that was also the feature in New York Times article, we looked at data from the CDC, and this time looking at the high school age youth. So this is the YRBS data from 1991 through 2017, identifying the trends in suicide behaviors over that span of time for high school age youth in the United States. So I wanted to look at the four categories of suicide behaviors that are indexed in the YRBS. So thinking about suicide, planning suicide, attempting suicide, and having an injury related to a suicide attempt. And so over that span of time, we wanted to also look at sex and racial differences. So again, not to bury the lead, the most striking finding that we observed was that there was a 73% increase in suicide attempts, but only for one group, and that was Black youth from the years 1991 through 2017. We looked at all the other racial and ethnic groups. There was no increase in suicide attempts over that span of time, only for one group, Black youth. And in follow-up, we looked at 1991 through 2019 and observed 144% increase, only for Black youth, right? What's interesting is that looking at the category of an injury related to a suicide attempt, there was also a statistically significant increase observed for Black boys, 122% increase. And this meant that there was a report of a suicide attempt that required some visit to the emergency room or some kind of professional attunement to the issue. And then looking at 2019 data, again, starting in 1991, there was 166% increase, and we observed no sex identity differences. So this led us to ask the question of whether Black youth were actually going right to an attempt, because in the other indices of suicide behaviors, those being thinking about suicide, planning suicide, we saw over the span of 1991 through 2017, a decrease in those trends for all groups. But when we got to the category of an attempt, we only observed the increase for Black youth, right? So we wanted to investigate whether this was this phenomena of going right to an attempt. So in a study that was published in Prevention Science, we looked at distinct patterns related to suicide attempts among those who had actually engaged in the behavior. right? And this was one of the first studies that actually applied the ideation to action framework, which has been rarely applied in the adolescent literature, but mostly in the adult literature. But it allows you to look within the group of individuals engaged in the behavior, this behavior being obviously suicide behavior, to determine any sort of distinctive patterns or differences among those who are engaged in the behavior. Because the reality is that in most of the suicide literature, we're often comparing those who are engaged in suicide behaviors versus those who are not. And so we endeavor to understand whether within the group of those engaged in behaviors, there are distinctive patterns. And so, again, not being able to go into all of the methods and analyses in greater detail, but our data based on report of engagement in one of these behaviors by the adolescents, and again, using the YRBS, the data fell into sort of 4 categories. One group that had thoughts only, a group that had thoughts and plans, a third group that had thoughts, plans, and attempts, and a fourth group that reported attempts only. And what we observed is that Black youth were almost 3 times more likely to report an attempt only in comparison to the referent group, which were white youth who reported thoughts, plans, and attempts. So almost 3 times more likely to report an attempt only. So this is concerning, obviously, in terms of whether we're able to surveil risk effectively. It also reflects that we may not be aware of the common warning signs that are thought to be related to a suicide attempt. And I argue that we can no longer afford to sort of have a cookie cutter approach with respect to surveilling suicide risk. And indeed, some of our recent work that we're doing, applying a machine learning perspective to analyzing suicide data, reflects that there are distinctive risk factors for suicide vis-a-vis race, ethnicity. So distinct patterns that look very different, whether you're Black, white, Latinx, Asian American, et cetera. And so we're concerned then that we should not be applying a sort of unilateral perspective on what is suicide risk. The other thing that I want to reflect on real quickly is that I didn't have time to post this, but in the slides, but when you look at the interpersonal theory of suicide, there are 3 domains of it, right? There's suicide capabilities, there's thwarted belongingness, and a sense of social connectedness, right? And so we actually have a new study that we did applying suicide capability to surveil or look at what is associated with risk for attempts. And one interesting sort of moderation effect that we observed was that even in the absence of the sort of indices of suicide behaviors like thoughts or plans, that the capability of a suicide attempt, and that includes carrying a weapon or having access to means, actually enhances your risk for a suicide attempt, right? So I'm going to talk about that in a few moments with respect to means restriction. So, the title of my talk was looking at overlooked signs, and I can sort of go over so many, but I'm only going to talk about a few here. The first one, which is related to actually the first presenter's comments about what happens in the context of schools, relates to punitive versus health promotive responses, right? And what we know is that in terms of looking at data related to suspensions and expulsions, there's disproportionality related to race. Black and brown youth are oftentimes suspended or expelled from school relative to white youth, right? And it's a problem. It's a persistent problem across the United States, right? And so this is a graph from the Department of Education reflecting that, in particular, Black youth are disproportionately expelled or suspended from school. This is one of my favorite studies to talk about. It actually is from the work of Lisa Janetian, who is now at Duke. But she looked at data from Chicago public schools and found that there was an effect of a family's ability to be food secure over the month and its relation to punitive responses in schools. And so there was this sort of effect of the family sort of running out of food stamps and the increase in behavioral infractions in schools, right? And so oftentimes we think about kids who are quote unquote bad apples or, sort of showing up to school to create havoc, but in actuality, it could be related to things that we're not thinking about: housing insecurity, food insecurity. And she indeed observed that in her data. So earlier I talked about this phenomena of not, having the wherewithal, if you're 15 to 17-year-old, perhaps, to be able to reconcile relationship challenges in a pro-social way. And I think this is directly related to the fact that only about 8 states in the US require social and emotional learning standards from pre-K through 12th grade, right? And we think that it's important that more and more states actually reflect these standards. And indeed, what we're observing in our society now is that there is some rollback on that, perhaps even in some states, because it's being connected to things that are really helpful, like helping youth understand how they identify and to be able to come to terms with that and to be able to express that in a free and loving way, right? So that's problematic. I'm always asked this question: is there an effect of race or discrimination related to the rising rates that we're seeing in suicide and suicide behaviors among Black youth? And I think that there is one. There's emerging evidence of the fact, right? And so I have this graphic up because it relates to an interesting study by Jacob Bohr and colleagues that was published in The Lancet that observed that if you were Black and you lived in a community or you lived proximal to a police shooting a Black person, you were more likely to report days of psychological distress, as opposed to if you were white and you lived in proximity to that shooting, you were likely to report no days of psychological distress. So I think that there is an effect of sort of experiencing the countless numbers of deaths via law enforcement or vigilantes that are happening in Black communities, brown communities, that I think does have a spillover effect for youth. I just want to also reflect that this kind of sort of question and analyses related to it has to happen with respect to youth. And we don't have those studies available to us yet, but I think help is on the way, which I'll talk about. So I've been really focused on setting a sort of policy and research agenda around these issues. But back to this point of means restriction, I think that one of the things that we can do for youth who are starting to evidence any signs of suicide, we have to restrict means. We have to engage in safety planning. I'm really fascinated by the work of Joan Arsenault at UCLA, and we're actually incorporating some of her work in one of our new studies around safety planning and ensuring that even youth who actually leave the ER with after presenting with a suicide attempt, we have to be able to help that youth and their family engage in the requisite safety planning that is going to protect them from another attempt. And so there's so much more that we can do around means restriction that is important. I'm really, really keen on this issue of providing mental health supports in every school. And in fact, the reality is that there are so many schools that don't have a social worker, don't have the requisite mental health providers in schools. And so we've been advocating for this at the federal level, that every school should have mental health professionals that kids can have access to, and it should be proportionate to the number of kids in schools. One professional cannot effectively work with 500 kids or 1,500 kids, which is actually quite the norm if you look further into this matter. So in terms of my work, it wasn't enough for us to publish this work in the high impact journals or to get grants related to this work. I had the opportunity some years ago to do a congressional briefing where we pointed out our work and these rising rates and compelled Congress to do something about it. So in April of 2019, we were part of the launch of the emergency task force on Black youth suicide. And I was asked to chair the working group of professionals that created this report, Ring the Alarm, the Crisis of Black Youth Suicide. And on the basis of that report, these are the congressional members who were a part of the task force. NIMH responded because we really, really need more research. And they actually cited our report as the basis of a new funding strategy around trying to address this issue. And so there's so many national centers that have been supported as a result. There's 2 national centers, one at the University of Pennsylvania, the other one at the University of Pittsburgh, that is focused on trying to understand this issue of Black youth suicide and why there are rising rates. We have a new study, an R01 study that we're doing in the context of ERs in New York City, and really building out a system of care to help Black youth be able to get connected to treatment post their visit to the ER. In one of our hospitals, the rate of Black youth who show up and go to the ER was about 6% go to treatment after an ER visit was about 6%, and the other hospital was about 4%. So really abysmal in terms of youth and families who follow up with aftercare treatment post a visit to the ER. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, what a couple of speakers to follow. I feel like giving a whole different talk now. It might just turn into that. Good morning. I'm Darlene Flynn. I'm the director of the Department of Race and Equity for the city of Oakland, California. And I'm not a researcher, but I use a lot of data in my work. I look at disparities like this all the time, and I make other people look at disparities like this all the time. That's my job. It's my job to bring that. I had not, however, seen this data, and I will be incorporating it into our work. I'm actually quite emotional. I wouldn't say triggered, but I knew that Black youth suicide was up. I was not unaware of it, but I've not seen it laid out so graphically, so thank you. Dr. Lindsey. I also understand that the development of youth identity around race, gender, et cetera, is incredibly important. And so feel very grateful also to hear about your research and your project. Education is my passion, though I'm a popular ed presenter. I am not a trained professional in this work, I come out of the popular ed discipline of the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. So my presentation is going to look a little different. I'm going to shake it up a little bit, I hope. But the point is to represent not information that you all are unaware of, because as data people, you're going to know something about almost everything I say today. But I want you to imagine my usual audience of city bureaucrats. And I myself am 35 plus year municipal bureaucrat and a 16 plus year equity and justice professional. So 16 of those years, right? Almost half of them. And so that's my trajectory. I started out as a policy analyst and as a legislative assistant for a city council member. And I ended up serving 4 years on a school board because really education and educational justice and equity was my passion, even though I'm not very much formally educated. I understand how education or withholding education has been used to keep my people down. So I just really appreciate all of you so much who are especially working on youth issues and issues related to schools and preventing the damage and harm that is done there. So I was very lucky to be recruited to come to Oakland from Seattle because the city council in Oakland passed an ordinance and made race and equity part of our law, our legal system in the city of Oakland, and they needed to recruit someone who could stand up a race and equity program there. And I'd been doing that work for 10 years in Seattle by that time. So I got to come down and work on this vision or this mission of intentionally integrating on a citywide basis the principle of fair and just in all the city does in order to achieve equitable opportunities for all people and communities. And I like to use this quote, which is not actually originally Barack Obama's. It's come forward all the way from the abolition of slavery times. It started back then, a minister, I can't remember which denomination, did a sermon on the arc of the moral universe and how it bends toward justice. Barack Obama did add the tagline though, but it does not bend on its own. So I'm a bureaucrat, I'm an equity professional, but I'm a change agent now. And my job is growing more change agents because justice isn't going to do itself, right? So just see this presentation not as the most enlightening information you've ever seen before, but see it in that light, that it's not easy for people necessarily to move from gatekeeper to change agent. And if we're just gatekeeping wherever we are, it doesn't matter where you're located or what you do. If all you're doing is gatekeeping, then all you're doing is maintaining the status quo. And structural and systemic racism is simply unacceptable. So why would any of us just sit on the fence? But the problem is none of us have been prepared to do otherwise. In fact, we've been educated to either navigate racism the way it is or to survive it the way it is, primarily, unless we were raised in an activist environment. Then we might have come front loaded with some stuff, and that's a good thing. But most of us did not get that. Most of us didn't get it. So my job is to help people get there. And the people I'm working with are all sorts of people in city government doing all sorts of jobs, education levels, et cetera. And I need a critical mass of those people to start walking together toward justice in our city government. So that's what I try to do. And I have a small crew. There's 4 of us. And we do a lot of training, a lot of coaching, a lot of technical assistance using equity tools to apply them to city policies, practices, and procedures to make them less racist, more multicultural, less monocultural, et cetera. So these slides are samples of the slides I actually use with people in the city of Oakland. First of all, it's a blame-free zone. We're not looking for the bad ones. We're not looking for the racists. We're not trying to hang any labels on anybody. Why? Because we know how it happened. We know how we got here. And all we're trying to do is unpack it, understand it so we can reverse engineer it. But we do remind people that we have a responsibility. We have rent to pay for the space we're taking up on this planet. And our rent is to leave it better than we found it. And if we're going to leave it better than we found it, we're going to have to deal with racism. We're going to have to deal with sexism. We're going to have to deal with classism. We're going to have to deal with some isms. We start with racism because race overlays on all the other isms. And you all are data people, so you know what happens when you disaggregate any outcomes by race. You see extreme differences, as were illustrated by Dr. Lindsey's presentation. So no blame, no shame, just responsibility, open mind, be willing to be re-educated about what you think you know about race, gender, etc. Right? That's all we ask of people. Now, the reason I got here, I know, is because of this resolution that we passed, right? Declaring racism a public health crisis. And that's not because any of us who wrote this. This was actually written by my department and the city attorney's office. So attorneys and barely social scientists, right? Not even dabblers in social science. But we decided that it was important for us to do this. My department had existed for a while. We were picking up good momentum, but we needed more support. And sometimes cities pass resolutions to put emphasis on things. So we did this. And the thing that stood out for this is just one of the many whereases. And if you want the whole thing, I can definitely provide it. But you'll see in there, it says white supremacy. And I got calls from all over the country saying, how in the world did you get a city council to vote for a resolution that had white supremacy in it? Well, that was 5 years of preparation. We'd been educating people about what we mean when we say white supremacy, right? And we're not talking about card-carrying KKK members. That we're talking about the kind of white supremacy that is embedded in all aspects of our society and must be named in order for us to undo it. That's all. Again, no blame, no shame. So you can see here, we begin to refer to all the socioeconomic conditions that impact people's lives, all of the conditions that create these exponential increases in Black youth suicide, right? And so we know that all of these things are linked together. We now know this because of you all and because of public health started this work of collecting disaggregated data many, many years ago. And so it is because of public health that we have a lot of the more advanced studies and so on that are done in other areas of social science, et cetera. So it is grounded in these things. Now, here's the hard thing about a resolution like this, and that is that our actions, our recommendations were not anywhere close to what is needed. And anybody with any sort of cutie around these issues knows that this is crumbs. It's barely anything. And yet, to get a city to, in the context of dismantling white supremacy, make any commitment publicly with a vote of a body of 9 is a pretty big deal. So it's both powerful and limited. It's just a little more tailwind that represents a whole lot more work that needs to be done. I like to just talk a little bit about DEI. That's gotten kind of big. I don't put it that way. It's diversity, inclusion, and equity in that order. It doesn't, the initials don't read as well that way because you do end up with die, but I actually tried that one time without thinking about it. And one of my staff members said, you just did die. And I said, yeah, I guess I can't do that. So, but the point is that we had to do diversity work before we could do inclusion work, and we had to do inclusion work before we could even contemplate equity and social justice work. So there is a trajectory here, but they're not the same. The move from diversity and inclusion to equity is a hard pivot. And this is what the hard pivot is. Diversity and inclusion are working at the individual level in various ways, in different ways at the individual level. Justice is about systems, because it is systems that has created the population level pervasive disparities that we can see in our society. So this is a hard pivot, and it's going to take a minute. And I do believe that it is because of this pivot that we have a war on critical race theory. Why? Because it works. You all know that. Preponderance of evidence, examination of the factors, the things that contribute to these outcomes. It's compelling. It is very compelling. That's why you all do the work you do. It's not just for the love of data and research. It's because you're trying to get somewhere. So we need to shut that down. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. That's the other talk I want to give, but I won't. We have got to push back. And I know it's scary, and I know people are being threatened and criminalized over this work. This is a moment for us to decide what we're made of and what we're here for. And I don't know what it's going to look like. I'm not prescribing any particular action. But just remember that if we give up at the front end, there's going to be nothing to save at the other end. So we have to figure that out together. We always want to define equity as being different from equality. You all have seen this, right? Okay, so you understand it. I'm not going to spend any time on it. But I usually break this down for people because a lot of bureaucrats who've been bureaucrats for a long time don't at all understand the difference between equality, so-called equality, which we haven't even achieved equality, but let's say we had, we still wouldn't have equity. So we spend quite a bit of time helping people understand that. We also define it with words, simple words, words people can use and understand. Fair and just inclusion, where all can participate and prosper, to create conditions that allow all to reach their full potential. And the last part's the most important. In short, equity creates a path from hope to change. And you have to have hope, but you also have to have change. And that's what we're about. So we use a concept called targeted universalism to get there, in case anybody thinks that we're going to now, do a bunch of affirmative action. We've already done that. And I have to say, affirmative action benefited me. It held the door open just a crack so I could get in and work twice as hard to get half as far, right? That's what affirmative, yeah, it did. It held the door open. It did, and a few of us slipped through. Not all of us. It didn't like throw the gate open and say, y'all come in and do the best you can. It barely opened it at all, because most of it has never been enforced or enforceable. It wasn't written to be. Most of the laws against discrimination, sorry, I'm trying to talk fast, have not been enforced, nor were they written to be truly enforceable. The burden of proof is so high, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're not doing affirmative action. And that's what's great about targeted universalism, a term developed by Dr. John Powell. It says that this is for the good of all society. It is not us. It's not rejiggering. It is reverse engineering, but it's not social engineering that is designed to just leapfrog people in a particular way. It is the universal. Oh, I used your language too. Do you like that? That's as relevant as I'm going to get today. It is this idea that we come together to create a better society, a more perfect union for all, right? But in order to get there, we have to have targeted focus. And you all have done that in this conference. Congratulations, right? And so we know we have to be evidence-based, race-conscious, institutionally focused, system-focused, institutionally focused, systemically aware, equity advancing. And what equity advancing means is predisposed to action. We want to be smart and learned and studied and researched, but that does nothing on its own, right? Oh, sorry, I went too fast. And I didn't let it play.
Really bad. What would you call it? The legal segregation. Like that day, pervasive racist housing policy still to this day disadvantages Black people in every aspect of life, because where you live can help decide what food you eat, what sort of jobs you can get, how safe you are, what sort of health care you can get, and the quality of your children's education. Do you know what that's called? That's called systemic racism. And yes, it's really a thing.
I know. That's Jay Smooth.
About systemic racism.
He's a vlogger out of New York City. He was sitting there just off Wall Street. Some of you might know that food court. And he does a lot of this kind of work. He's gotten quite well known, and he's also popular ed. And so he's got a whole series of videos that were developed together with Race Forward that's in Oakland, so that people can access this information easily on the internet machine. We have a very specific definition of institutionalized racism. It's very frank. This is how a city council could pass a resolution with white supremacy in it. A pattern of social institutions such as governmental organizations, schools, banks, and courts of law perpetuating negative treatment toward a group of people based on their race. Institutional racism leads to inequity and opportunity inequality and opportunity and inequity in life outcomes. So there are many definitions of systemic and institutionalized racism, but this is a pretty easy to understand one. It's also very easy to prove. And you're in the perfect city to do that. I yesterday spent quite a few hours at the African American Museum, and there is also a just profoundly impactful Native American museum here, thanks to the Smithsonian. If you don't know about this, and a lot of us didn't or don't, you can get a real quick study right here in Washington, D.C. in 2 buildings. There's many more Smithsonians to enjoy or to participate in. I'd start with those 2. We have some working assumptions. Race matters. We have the indicators that say so. Predictable life outcomes, right, based on race. Disparities are often created and maintained inadvertently or intentionally through policies and practices that contain barriers to opportunity. Also documentable. This is all empirical. These are assumptions that we're using to replace people's misconception about what causes racial disparities, right? It's possible and only possible to close equity gaps by using strategies determined through an intentional focus on race. And yes, we're going to have to get out of that box that we've lived in for most of our lives in order to get there. If opportunities in all key areas of well-being are equitable, then equitable results will follow. Simple logic statement, also pretty demonstratable by even some of the work that we've been talking about today. And then finally, given the right message, analysis, and tools, people will work toward racial equity. Now, this is hope or optimism or however you want to think. It's not Pollyanna. It's actually proven social science. This is based on change theory, right? If you help people get there, they will help you change things. Now, not everybody will. I'm just barely old enough to remember the civil rights movement. Not everybody was on board, but some change happened. So that was critical mass, preponderance of evidence, and some very, very good organizing that went on for decades before the tipping point happened. So we're just working on another tipping point now. Don't get discouraged. We'll get there. They didn't. We can't. They didn't stop. We can rest, but we can't quit. We can't quit till we get there. So we have a change theory, a theory of change that is based on how institutions, how society changes. My points are not wanting to. We clarify the business case and a shared vision for equity. I'm doing a little bit of that here, but I'm having to skip across the surface. We prepare advocates and leadership to advance equity. We build infrastructure and political will to support the change. That resolution would fit into that category. We apply new skills and tools because we need new skills and tools, because if we just keep doing what we've always done, we're going to keep getting what we've always got. So we're working on those, and they're developing. This change, movement building and change, advancing change is a project of building it as you go. It's getting better. We're getting better at it. Again, thus the pushback. It is not an accident that we're experiencing this. It's because we're being effective. So we work to develop action plans focused on change in policies, procedures, and practices. We focus on the elements that define the institution. That's what you focus on, not the individual people necessarily. Don't get me wrong. There's some problem people, but to focus on people one by one is not going to get us there. We have to focus on the standards, the norms, the policies, the procedures that permit those behaviors to continue. Because we know how to stop behaviors if we decide to. We'll be as punitive as we need to be. That's how the U.S. rolls. So we know how to do this, but we have to decide to do it. And then we work hard to measure progress and recognize accomplishments, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. So that's where you all come in, because we actually do need your skills and your talents to help us measure progress and recognize accomplishments, not just measure disparities. We start with the disparities because we've got to understand what we're up against. But we also want to be able to measure our progress. And that's what I tell people who might be feeling discouraged, particularly in these political times. Take a 100-year look. Take a 100-year look, right? Again, I know the shoulders I stand on. I know what my people went through. Take a 100-year look and take heart. Just keep moving. If you can't walk, if you run, if you can't run, walk, can't walk, crawl. Do what you got to do. Just keep moving forward. That was Dr. King, very poorly quoted. Sorry. We really have to change the narrative, and you all can really help with this wherever you are, because the narrative is designed to keep this problem in place. So we have to be really intentional about educating ourselves about redlining and the war on drugs and all kinds of other very explicit policy moves that have been made to keep things the way they are. Again, not because you're all going to teach history, but because if we understand the history, we better understand how to undo it, right? I'm usually do a whole lecturette on redlining. I'm not going to do that. But if you're not aware of redlining or have not looked at it closely, I strongly recommend this book to you. Yeah, I tell anybody that works in government, particularly municipal government, definitely needs to read this book. And it's available on audio. You can do it. Listen to it in the car. The Color of Law. And on June 1st, I think they're going to release an action guide to go with it. And so I've already ordered it. Can't wait to see it. Don't know what it's going to say, but if it's half as rigorous His partner on the guide is an organizer. So, and organizing is the way we make change happen. You all know that, right? Sometimes it's formally done, sometimes it's informally done, but nothing is really accomplished alone. It's got to be collective. It just does. So they're going to add another layer to this that's about that. I'm so excited to see it. So this is life expectancy in Oakland. That was Oakland area. It was several cities, actually. That was Oakland's redlining map. This is Oakland's life expectancy map. It's kind of the opposite of the other one in that the more saturated the color, the longer you live. So let me just go back for just a second. Now, Oakland is in the middle of that big blob. And then there's other cities on both sides. So just kind of freeze that. So that's red to green, right? You all know how redlining worked. If you didn't, you're going to read a book or at least an article after this. And then I want you to, again, see this data map about life expectancy. Now, you might notice that the people in the green and yellow areas live a lot longer than the people from the other map, than the people in the red-lined areas, because red-lined areas are where people of color were relegated to, and all of the other bad things happen to them there. And it's so much easier through segregation to target people, right? Geographic segregation makes it possible to do all kinds of terrible things without trying. I mean, just know, as long as you can border people and know where they are, right? So we know that these things correlate, and we know that through John Paligan's work that it's about high opportunity and low opportunity. You're going to get different results here than you're going to get here. That's my easy way of explaining it. Not so scientific, but you get the picture. People say they always remember that. But besides the picture itself about where people have to live their lives and raise their children, that has been designed by our government and our other institutions, social institutions and otherwise, we have a whole narrative that even makes it worse. It says that that really how people's lives turn out is about winners and losers and their individual effort, their merit or their deficit of merit. People get what they deserve, right? It's a meritocracy. And then we just back it up with highly racialized assumptions. Now, I could also say racist ideas there, right? You know, those are fancy words for racist ideas. So what this leads to is no change. That narrative will always produce durable, persistent, and racialized poverty built around just accepting and tolerating the societal problem by framing it as an individual issue. You see, if it's up to you and you and you and you to figure it out, there's nothing for us to do. Isn't that perfect? So perfect. So we always want to be looking for where we see elements of this dominant worldview in ourselves and in our work, and we want to interrupt it. Don't just let it roll. We want to at least be able to bring it up, talk about it, say, wait a second, are we operating from some flawed logic, right? So we have an equity frame we replace it with, and of course, the scientists in you know that this is true. The individual develops in the context of access to opportunity. That ain't no lie. Government has a role in addressing structural barriers. Government had a role in erecting most of them. Replace community marginalization with agency. Notice I didn't say empowerment. There's nothing wrong with our empowerment, except that our power was, limited, was taken away in various ways. But what we did was marginalize communities of color. That's the collective royal we, have for hundreds of years marginalized people of color communities in the US and in other places. And so what we simply want to do is give them back their agency. In other words, get out of their way. Get out of their way, open the door, remove the barriers, just provide them with rights, agency, rights. We have to have community involved solutions because otherwise we're going to get it wrong. Even those of us that are very educated and have a lot of technical knowledge are not going to get it right without the community themselves, whether it's the teachers or the students or et cetera, the neighbors, the neighborhood. They're absolutely necessary for true transformation because we'll miss pieces if we don't get the right people at the table, right? Grassroots policy project. Yeah. And what we're looking for is transformation. But what we're looking for is transformation to liberty and justice for all. We're basically doing remedial work as a nation. That's what we're doing. It's not radical. It's right in our founding documents. We just have to get there. We just haven't achieved it yet. That's all. We're still working on it. So we want to see where we see that in our environment as well, where we are making progress, where we are talking about it, where we are trying new approaches, and where we are being honest and truthful and looking at hard stuff like youth suicide data. Where we are doing that, we want to give ourselves and others credit, support, cheer them on. We have to do that because this is hard work. So both look for the negative and the positive to keep moving. So we don't want to just tell a different version of the same story. This is another, I just like it because the fence is gone. I don't like that the people are different heights. That's one of the critiques of that graphic. This goes back to an older version, but it does show that beyond equity is liberation. And we sometimes think that that liberation is just for the oppressed, but I want to remind you and myself every day that what oppresses some of us to a greater degree oppresses all of us to some degree. There is just no avoiding it. And last night at the city council meeting I attended remotely, the fire chief got up and told him the most powerful story about equity. And I don't always expect to hear that from a fire chief. Not that fire chiefs are bad people, but they tend to be command and control and, you know, regulation focused, and getting them to talk about the squishy stuff isn't always so easy. But he got up and told a story about we're facing a budget deficit, which is not unusual in Oakland. We're a majority people of color city, therefore we're poor. That's unusual on the West Coast, but that's where Oakland is and has been for a long time. And so we're cutting the budget. And one of the things that they're proposing to do to save money in the fire budget is what's called a rolling brownout, where they reduce staff at the fire station on a rolling basis, right? They roll it through the city. So it's, you know, goes up and down. Every fire station goes up and down every period, whatever that period is. And, but he said he got up to the council and he made a very explicit equity pitch, and he's asking them not to mess with it. He said, Fire Station 20 is the lifeline for our poorest community in the city of Oakland. It is their alternative health care. It's not fires. It is life-saving responses to people who are critically ill. And this is their only hope of surviving whatever chronic illness is taking them down. 911, the fire department, and the aid car, right? That station does 4,000 calls a year. Oakland's not that big a city, by the way. It's around 500,000. And that one station, 4,000 responses a year. Okay, we have another part of Oakland where it's up there where the life expectancy is 10 to 12 years longer, up there. It's called the Hills, and they're adjacent to wildfire country. And about 25 years ago, there was a horrific wildfire that came up the canyon the other side and over the ridge, and people got trapped because a tree came over the road and there was only one way out. It's a very exclusive, hard to reach neighborhood, right? Incredible views of the San Francisco Bay and all kinds of luxurious, wonderful attributes about living there, except it's probably someplace we shouldn't have built, right? It's a little bit dangerous if there's a wildfire. That was 25 years ago, 29 people died, terrible tragedy. The city is still recoiling from it because it was awful. But then think about 4,000 calls a year and wonder how many of those people actually survive, because they're calling because they're in crisis and it's likely to be very serious. So if you think about those numbers, they're not even comparable, right? And those folks obviously have the best of healthcare and everything else that they need, all the opportunity in the world. But they're concerned about this brownout because it's going to affect their fire station because they have 400 calls a year. 400 calls a year. And he wanted to make sure to get that on the record so the city council didn't necessarily respond, because what voices get listened to in our society? And he said, as long as I'm here, Station 20 is not going to have a brownout. They're doing other fire suppression measures. They're doing all kinds of work with the folks in the hills to try to keep them safe. They're not ignoring them. Trust me, we would never do that in the city of Oakland. But they're not going to sacrifice Station 20 to protect. I don't know what the other station's number is. I didn't get it. So anyway, the point is we have to learn to tell a different story. Those are the stories we have to tell in order to get people's attention. And I was so proud of my fire chief. So you'll know this graphic. It came out of public health. That's why I think some of you might know it. It's not really health focused anymore, but this is my last slide. I'm going to shut up now. This is my last slide. This was about health impacts upstream versus downstream, right? And so I took it and I applied it to conditions in our cities. And what it's designed to do is notice that when we focus only on individual behaviors and treat problems resulting, I use the language low opportunity because that's our vocabulary, resulting from low opportunity, we're constantly putting Band-Aids on wet skin. That's how I talk about it since it's a river. We're trying to do remedial care. We're trying to help people. We're trying to save people. We're pulling the babies out of the river. We're all kinds of metaphors. But down there, we're talking about people that if you look down at the bottom, they're crime involved, they're dropped out, they're crime involved, they're over policed, they're incarcerated, they're homeless, they're unemployable, they're reincarcerated. We're stuck in a loop down there, right? With our hardest to serve communities. So we must push upstream in our vision. And we're kind of in this middle realm right now in our work. We're looking at policies, practices, and programs to provide community conditions that support reduction. It's harm reduction. It's more active and more upstream harm reduction that support this reduction in disparities and create greater equity. But what we really want is a just society. That's that most extreme edge of the other graphic. What we want is changed structures and institutional practices that maintain inequities, racially just systems centering result-based accountability, inclusive, fair, and political structures, ample education and other public services and funding, education reform and accountability for children of color, accountable for children of color outcomes, structural barriers within and between institutions removed, inequitable practices such as the war on drugs and private prisons ended. So what I'm hoping you'll recognize is that while your specialty area is different than our specialty area, we all need to be in this game. Because if we're not, we will all fail. It is all of us or none of us. And a lot of times when we get in our specialties, we think maybe as a private citizen, we should be involved in that, or, we might be politically active in some of that structural change work politically. But what I'm saying is all of our professional endeavors across the nation and in every discipline need to be focused like this so that we can get out someday, so we can finally have the society that we all long for. So I invite you to, if you haven't already, begin your transformation from gatekeeper to change agent. Thank you.
All right. Well, I once again, I would really like to thank all of our panelists for wonderful presentations. It was really an honor to learn from all of you this morning. And I also thank you for your commitment to issues of social equity and social justice. And so unfortunately, we're out of time for questions. But the good news is on Friday, we will have a culminating plenary session on Friday morning. So we'll have an opportunity to engage with questions with most of the panelists from the first through plenary sessions. But once again, thank you very much.